All right. So we have been wanting to test out the podcast, which for this particular situation, we have a valuation and a mediator podcast. And Amy has been on those podcasts and has a lot of information. So we're testing out a live version of the podcast in a capacity that maybe we can answer questions. And so I think, though, to get it kind of started off, and Amy Adler is here because of one of her credentials that I think is really important, a CDFA. And you might know about that or have researched about that and looking for divorce. But Amy's got a little bit more personal side of this story. And I think that it would be helpful. We're headed into the holidays. Like you had some experience with divorce and co-parenting and holiday stress. And we had kind of set to talk about, some of this stuff, but you have, a kind of an interesting situation. So I don't know if you want to talk about your background or you want to talk about the fun holiday delight that you're experiencing, but you can also ask questions and we'll try to address questions during this, but we'll be talking a little bit of just how to maybe get through um, the holidays and in general deal with finances. So we'll go wherever it goes, right, Amy? But how's everything going today with the fun?
Well, I've seen better days. It's actually not related to the holidays, but it's definitely related to my children's father, my first ex-husband, and money. So it is certainly very relevant to the work that I do with my clients. I always say every time I have a really unpleasant experience with my ex-husbands, it's really just market research. I'm learning so that I can be able to pay it forward and share that information and help clients avoid the risk of these things happening to them in their future post-divorce lives. So my story is, I've been a CPA and accountant in the audit fraud investigation worlds for 20 years. And my first divorce happened 15 years ago when my children were just under 2 and 4. So my kiddos are now 16 and 18. So life is very different from when we first got divorced. And our divorce decree talked about how we were going to handle decisions related to the kids. And it also talked about child support and how we were going to share expenses and all that kind of stuff. And actually, within months, I realized that the divorce decree wasn't working out financially. And we went back to mediation because I couldn't deal with the agreement that we had. So we had to redo our agreement for financial issues related to the kids a year and a half after our divorce was final to redo it. And then we have not done anything since then legally, but have been struggling to be able to co-parent effectively, both from a financial and a logistical standpoint. So the timing of this issue coming up is fun because now I can share it live and hopefully more than just my clients will be able to benefit from this experience.
Well, and like, I think it's an interesting thing because when people get divorced, normally they're just like, there's two issues. There's money and kids, right? And one of the things that you're talking about is like a parenting plan that typically people put together. And I know, I also have a stepchild and, a lot goes into that parenting plan, but you're sometimes creating it like you guys created it when they were 2
and 4. Yeah.
2 and 4. And do you think you put everything in the agreement that you should have thought about? Or do you think there's things that you didn't think about that you're dealing with now? Or
there were definitely things we didn't think about from a financial standpoint. The logistics actually, we've actually maintained our custody schedule and all of the decision-making stuff the same all along. That has actually worked out okay. I wouldn't say that it's ideal, but it has been okay. We've done a 2-2-5-5 schedule for the entire time that we've been divorced, but also realizing that if we're effectively co-parenting and we're being kind towards our children and our ex-spouses, when there's a need to change schedules, then we're, as cooperative as we can be to make that happen. And we were, for the most part, let me just put it this way. When he needed to change the schedule, I was accommodating.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, how are you even dealing with that? Because you put it together a decade ago, and now when things kind of arise, it's still like there's still a lot of discussion points. Even like sometimes that agreement only establishes, like you said, the 225. Like, what does that mean? Like, what does that have to do with kids?
So for us, that was just our possession schedule when the kids would be with each of us. So for me, it was every Monday and Tuesday night they were with me, and every Wednesday and Thursday they were with him. And then we flip-flopped the 3 nights of the weekends, so that effectively whoever had them the weekend would have them 5 nights in a row. And the exchanges were always at school. So they'd get dropped off at school or at camp or whatever they were doing during the day, and then the other parent would pick them up. So, officially the transfer occurred at 8 a.m. on whatever day was the transfer day. So if a kid got sick at school, whoever's day it was starting at 8 a.m. would be responsible for picking them up and taking care of them if something like that happened. So we were able to handle that pretty well because we knew that it was going to be that way, and we were able to plan our schedules to make it work. The sticking points for us were more related to the money, because not long after our divorce, my ex found another partner who had her own career and had her own assets, and she contributed financially to their marriage, and so they were much more financially, I wouldn't say stable, but financially sound, financially plush, abundant than I was as a single parent. And getting married a second time for me happened a few years later, but my husband was living in another state. So we never actually combined households, and our marriage only lasted 2 years because long distance marriage just was too hard and too stressful on both of us with young kids at the time. So really effectively, I was a single parent in my own household the entire time that I was co-parenting with him. So financially, it was definitely a big challenge for me to make it work, and less so for him. That said, our divorce decree was very specific and did not include the expectation that only one of us would have another spouse who would be contributing financially to the household. So that was completely irrelevant to the documents and therefore to him. So, our decree was very, we did have a child support arrangement initially, and it was very small. It wasn't, his portion of child support didn't even cover anywhere close to half of the kids' basic expenses. And so, and sharing the kids' expenses was really the most important thing to me. We both had roofs to put over their heads, and we're fine with taking care of their basic needs, food, clothing, and shelter. So it was really just the daycare and the extracurriculars and, the medical care and all that other stuff that I agreed to pay for, but he was paying child support at the time. And that just was too much of a burden on me initially, since his contribution of child support was not half of those expenses. I ended up bearing the biggest burden of it. So that's why we went back to mediation a year and a half later, and we agreed to split. But our mediation agreement specified the types of expenses that would be included in this 50-50 split, and that we would settle up every so often on who has paid for what and how much, and figure out who owes who and how much. But there was no timeline. There was no expectation for, you're going to settle up once a quarter. It just says you'll settle up occasionally and you'll share information to settle it up. And that mediation agreement did not specify anything after the kids turned 18. And this is where I think the legal system really fails families in the divorce process, because in every state that I've had clients in and have been involved in divorces, once the child turns 18 or graduates from high school, whichever is later, there's no financial responsibility or custody related responsibility either for these children. They're legally adults, and therefore there is no legal responsibility on either parent's part in the decree to take care of them financially. But we all know that 18-year-olds don't typically graduate high school and immediately go to jobs where they make enough money to live on their own. So they need money. They need assistance from their parents, at least for another few years to get on their feet. Whether they go to college or not is irrelevant. And then if they do go to college, how are they going to pay for that? Especially now that the cost of college is so high that, if they took loans out to pay for their entire college education, they'd never pay them off. So this is part of where our challenge is coming in now that I have an 18-year-old who graduated in May. She started college in August, and now her dad says he's not financially responsible for her anymore. And because my family agreed to help her financially through her first year of college, he thinks that he's completely off the hook and that he doesn't have to contribute anything to any other expenses as a result. And so that has caused a rather large argument because our kids are still financially reliant on us. And if he refuses to do it, then I have to, or else our kids suffer. And this is interestingly a conversation that I have with a lot of my clients too, is it more important to stand up for ourselves and not allow ourselves to be walked all over by our exes? Or is it more important to do what we think is best for our kids? And that is basically forcing us to choose between getting shot or stabbed. Mm-hmm. We're going to have to get one or the other because we lose in all circumstances there. And that has really been my life for the last 15 years. For most of those years, I just sucked it up and took care of whatever my kids needed because I felt like that was the right thing to do for my kids. I didn't want them, especially because they were so young, I didn't want them to have to experience the hell of having important financial balls dropped just because their dad doesn't want to help or even like organize things and be responsible for registrations or anything.
Well, that's the manipulation that I think we see in the financial area in divorce is like, oh, I'm not going to pay for the kid. And then, the kid's like, well, and kind of in the middle, like, well, dad says they're not going to pay, or mom, like it can be roles reversed. And then the other parent is sort of left with the ball. And it does feel like manipulation. It does feel like kind of using the kids against, and, I think we even glossing over the effect on the kid, right? It's that parent that has to sit there and then continue to, and a lot of states, and you can tell some perspective of what you have, the court's not really going to make you have to pay for college or make you have to do some of these things for your kids. So if you don't agree to some plan or you don't have the conversation, I don't think that I should have to pay for my kids' college anyway. And so now you could have two people that believe two different things and you're in a crux. Like that's manipulation though. And are you seeing some of that in other areas with the kids as well, in general, in divorce?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I mean, I see so often the kids are used as a weapon to manipulate one parent from the other. And it's usually financial, but it's also with, possession schedules. Sometimes they'll not allow them to go visit, with the schedule, the parenting plan in the decree specifies the schedule, but when parents agree to switch something up for whatever reason, it's fine, but they have to both agree. And so when it works out, it's great. But when it doesn't, it can be used as a weapon. There were definitely a lot of circumstances where especially because my second husband was in another state. I had to travel back and forth to go visit him. And oftentimes he would come, most of the time he would come here to where I am in Texas. But when I would go there, occasionally it would fall on a weekend when I was supposed to be with the kids. And I would have to try to negotiate with him to get him to switch weekends with me so that the following weekend could be mine instead or something. And he would often use that as a weapon. He'd be like, well, okay, then, you have to pay for something, or I'm not going to pay for something in exchange for this, for giving you this benefit. And then, the same thing in the reverse would happen again later or earlier when he would want to have the schedule changed, but certainly wouldn't be wanting to bring up paying for something else in exchange for my kindness and willingness to be accommodating. It was just an expectation. So yes, to answer your question, yes, I think there's financial and logistical and even just relational communication options for using the kids as a weapon. When, like my ex used to try to tell my kids that I was a bad parent, basically, because I wasn't willing to pay for or take the time to do something that required a lot of work on my part, time-wise, for them, when he's equally responsible for not being willing to pay for or make the time to do X that they wanted to do. But he would just tell them, your mom doesn't want to do it, or your mom isn't willing to do it, so therefore you don't get to do it. And that's also manipulation, because then he's attempting to make me look bad to the kids and hurt my relationship with them. So I guess there's just a lot of ways that people can poke at each other and make things miserable for each other when they want to.
Well, and I think that when people are first, like, even considering getting divorced, they're like, am I gonna get the kids? Is a 50-50 normal or not? I think a lot of people think that it's going to either be with one parent or not. I know that we've seen, for the most part, 50-50 custody is kind of normal, unless there's extenuating circumstances like substance abuse or, other types of bad behavior that can be proven, or mental health issues. For the most part, the court's trying to have both parents have access to the kids, but sometimes people want to say, well, I'll let you have more time with the kids, and I want to pay, and that's really to try to pay less money, right? Mm-hmm. And that's also something that we see. Do you see the courts really accepting that, oh, you're going to pay less money because you've decided you don't want to take all this time with the kids?
No, the courts actually take the opposite stance, that money and possession are not connected. That no, you don't get to reduce your contribution just because you're taking more time with the kids, nor do you get to hold the kids and not allow them to see the other parent just because they haven't paid child support or whatever they're supposed to pay. You cannot do that. The courts get really angry.
Well, and I think even when you're discussing like how to do the exchange, right? There's other ways of even doing, like the concept of nesting, right? Have you heard of this concept? Maybe you could explain a little bit about, all other ways that you've seen that are options of, sharing custody in some capacity, because it's not just like, okay, we're going to pick you up on this date, or we're going to drop you off on this date. Like, it's not as easy as that all the times, because people have different, I've seen like nurses who have 3 12-hour days and need kind of a different arrangement. But having seen some that you have recommended or that you like as alternatives in this space, just to give some ideas.
I really like to customize based on their situation. So like what you just explained with the nurse, I actually had some clients who one spouse was a stay-at-home, work from home employee, and the other one was a physician's assistant who did have like 3 12-hour shifts in a row and then would be off for a few days. And but the schedule was not put out until the week of. So it was very different, and it was different days of the week that she would have that schedule, that she would have the 12-hour shifts. So to have one of those standard 2255 or even the first, third, fifth weekend schedules that are standardized didn't really work for them. So what they did was they put in the I think it's the 2255 now, if I remember correctly. It's been a couple years since this client finalized, but I think it's the 2255. But then within their decree, it also says, recognizing that as long as she has this role, that she will not be able to make good on her possession schedule on some weeks, and that in those circumstances, she will provide him with her schedule when she receives it, and will work with him to switch the days in that week as needed. So, and it says that he will allow her to switch the days within the weekdays. So like not weekends, but weekdays she could take. So he negotiated back to be like, no, you can't have a weekend in lieu of a weekday, but you can have Tuesday instead of Friday or something if you need to because of your work schedule. So, and that's worked pretty well for them since then. They've both been pretty accommodating to that need.
Yeah.
So, that's just an example of an alternative that is a possibility. Now, I wouldn't recommend that necessarily for people who are like my ex-husband and I, who can't get along and he uses the kids as a weapon. That would be very detrimental to our situation, because then he would use that to his advantage every opportunity he could. And then I would be miserable. So,
well, and even in talking about like the kids, that the money that's attached or that we normally look at that as child support. The other that we talk about is maintenance, and people are kind of surprised when it's called maintenance. We also know it as alimony, and each state kind of has different terms for it. But for like, I think most people, if they're concerned about the kids, then the next one is, okay, how am I going to live? Like, how am I going to pay for things? Am I making any money? I haven't worked in 20 years. What does that look like? And maybe we can talk a little bit about that, because I think more people are either concerned about paying it or if they're going to receive it. And each state is different, but there's also calculations that kind of go into it. So maybe you can explain how you even figure out if you're going to be paying it or receiving it.
Okay, so I will happily share what I know about that. But before I go into that level of detail, I will say almost every single case, I will say, let's look at what's needed and what's available in terms of income and expenses on both sides, both parents' sides. And let's not really pay attention to what the state's requirements are or their guidelines are, because what I find is that most of the states have very specific rules around those things unless it's contractually negotiated. And those specific rules are not fair to a lot of people. Almost always there's a significant demographic of people that are disserved by going by those guidelines. So I will say the approach that I take in my, mediation on steroids process, which is what I thought what I initially thought we were going to talk about today before this issue came up, is to spend time doing some budgeting. Like, let's understand what the expenses look like on both sides and the income looks like on both sides, so that we can evaluate what's available and what's needed in the near term future, at least. I mean, we can't look at budgeting for the long term. That's impossible to do, since people's lives change so significantly in the first couple of years after divorce. But also now realizing that my kids' expenses have changed drastically in the 15 years since our divorce was final too, that I would not have been able to really think ahead or to know about enough ahead to plan for. Like the $2,000 repair on my son's car that is due right now in my ex-husband is refusing to contribute to it and has stated that he's going to drop the car off in my driveway and force me to take care of it. So that's a nice little aside there. So as it relates to the maintenance or child support, you look at the state's guideline. I always look at the state's guidelines behind the scenes to see what it is. In Texas, alimony and maintenance rules are probably among the most difficult to meet to actually qualify for it than in most states, than like in Florida and California, where it's almost automatic and there's a specific calculation for how much and what length of time they get it. So that's usually why I try to steer people away from going by the state guidelines, because they're really somewhat arbitrary, in all honesty.
But it's also like a reality check. Like you're basically saying you can either look at the state guidelines, you can either look at like what is the max or minimum that you can, maximum you can get, minimum you can pay, or you start having a conversation with your spouse if you can, and start to figure out like what is the reality. But a lot of people kind of hide the ball or play games. Like you've been divorced for 15 years and it's still games being played, so I mean, divorce sort of ends but doesn't in some capacity, right?
Yep. Well, we're forever tied to each other because we had kids together. Yes, that is reality for sure.
And some of those behaviors you probably saw in the divorce and everything else. But in figuring out, like it is hard having a conversation of like, oh, okay, so are you going to pay me $3,000 a month forever going forward? Because I contributed 20 years to this endeavor, and now you make a ton of money and I don't make a lot of money. Like that's a difficult discussion to have. And you kind of encourage people to also look at like, what do you need? Not just, everybody always has this, oh, I should be allowed to have this lifestyle that I've grown accustomed to, right? So if I've been buying purses or if I've been going on vacations, I should be able to continue that. And this is a very different discussion about what do you need in order to kind of live the next part of this life that you're going to do,
Yeah, exactly. It's oftentimes really hard to get the chip off of people's shoulders when they come into the conversation with the approach that they want to keep living the same lifestyle that they've been living, when that's in reality not going to be an option. I mean, a lot of people do their homework before they come to me, and so they know what the state guidelines are for child support and alimony, and they come in saying, well, if I went to court, I would only have to pay this, or I would have to pay nothing. So if I'm willing to pay a little bit, that's very kind of me. And so in those circumstances, we have more limited ability to negotiate there because they know already what the state's guidelines are and are willing to lean on that as their their crutch, their argument, which is understandable, right? Because it's true, if they went to court, that is most likely what would happen. Although I say most likely, I really mean possibly what will happen, since judges have the right to decide whatever they want whenever they want, and it depends on their mood that day and whether or not they like you. So
yeah, pretty much. And I think that that's what people have to be mindful of, is that, the biggest issue with the court system is the unknown. And in a lot of divorce courts, the judges will rotate in and out because nobody really likes divorce court, because it's a little, we're seeing people at not the best times of their lives, and it's very, stressful and dramatic. But it's kind of interesting because the things that you can do by going to mediation or by being able to even have conversations with your spouse is that you take some of that control back, and you keep some of those secrets private. And those are the benefits of figuring out another way to go around the court. But those judges are going to be new potentially every couple of years, and they might not even get in the swing of doing cases by the time that they're rotating out. So you have a lot of just unknown. Even if you reach out to attorneys that know the area, know the judges, know the court system, or experts that know the court system, there's still this huge unknown in the fact that it's a new judge. Like right now, we have a couple courts, and everybody's like, oh, we got all these new judges, which means you can't predict what's going to happen. And even if you think you can predict what's going to happen, a lot of it comes down to the perception of you in the court. Are you hiding things? Are you doing things that were bad to the kids or your spouse and things like that? Like the court is taking in a lot more information than just like, you make 500,000, I make 50,000, pay me some money, right? I mean, what are some of do you have any crazy things that you've seen the court do, or?
Oh my gosh. Yes. Yes. Well, so the other issue is that most judges are attorneys and they're not financial experts, and they don't really fully understand the financials in a couple's life. I mean, they have a few minutes to look at it, or maybe a few hours to look at it in a trial, and that's it. So, there's so much complication to an estate in a lot of cases, that it's hard for a judge, even if he or she was highly educated about finance and understood tax consequences and income requirements for mortgages and things like that, and refi allowability and rates and all of that. So,
and even keeping it at the basics, like most clients are just frustrated in the fact that there's so much conversation in a court that happens between the attorneys and the judge in chambers, which means behind closed doors. The clients are still sitting out in the courtroom and usually looking at their spouse well, I wonder what they're talking about in there. And a lot of times they're talking about the finances. Sometimes I go back there, you might go back there, right? And we're oh, let us explain some math to you. But a lot of times it's just that they're trying to figure out a way to settle it, but they might not include you. You as the client that is getting divorced, who thinks, well, I should be in the room, I should be discussing this. These are called settlement conferences or status conferences, or these different types of meetings that right now I get so many clients that are well, why am I not in that meeting? And reasons for it, but you have to be mindful that you are, you are going to be on the outside of some of this process. The attorneys and the judge do try to settle things. And so in those cases, if you had a mediator that you had coming in, that you and your spouse are kind of okay, this person seems reasonable, that person is really there just to help referee the communications, give you ideas of oh, you guys think it's just, left or right, black or white, but there's a lot of gray in the middle there. And I don't think that people understand that that is one way to take a little bit more control back, but it also means that, can you communicate, right? And if you can't communicate, picking a mediator that can help wrangle that conversation is going to be better than picking up somebody that's how are your feelings? What are your feelings? Or if you have complex finances, it's hard to understand this stuff. Most people don't understand it. You're not stupid.
No, even the most educated CPAs hire me because they don't know the rules around divorce.
Yes. It's like, even if you understand, I tell this to a lot of people, even if you're a CPA, so you're an accountant, you're a lawyer, you're a financial advisor, right? And you live in this world of accounting and finance, literally divorce is the twilight zone. And
Yes.
whatever you think, like when 2 plus 2 would equal 4 in the real world, in divorce land, it could be like 4.135. Like there is some sort of degree of metric that it's sort of, and then it's different in every state. Like you operate in community property states. Like tell us about that cluster. That is, and so you have to be concerned about what state you are living in when you file for divorce, because that's the state you're going to get divorced in potentially. I mean, some states got other rules, but tell us a little bit about the fun of community property states and like what it means. Like, what does it even mean in general?
Oh gosh, yeah. So community property is a good term because it's very easy to explain. It means what it says, that the assets and debts that are acquired during a marriage are considered a community asset or debt in theory, in general. So the contrast to that is what they call separate property, which is assets or debts that belong only to one of the spouses, and they may have other owners outside of the family, but only one of the two spouses. And that in the situation of divorce, separate property assets and debts are not subject to be divided like the rest of like the marital estate would be, which is another term for community property. So what that looks like is in a situation where they're in a community property state and somebody came into a marriage with assets, like for example, myself, when I got married the second time, I already had a house. He already had a house. So we both had our own assets. We both had retirement plans. We both had savings accounts. We both had all this stuff. And we were only married for 2 years. So only what was earned and saved during those 2 years by both of us, by either of us, is part of the community. And all the things that we came into the marriage with beforehand was our separate property. So there are other reasons, other circumstances when assets or debts would be considered separate property other than just coming into the marriage with it, but that's an example. So in those states, it's different from the equitable division states, or what do they call common property states, because everything that's in a person's ownership then becomes potentially subject to division. But also in general, the assumption is whoever's name the asset or debt is in is who the owner of that asset or debt belongs to in those other states. So community property couldn't care less whose name an asset or debt is in. If it was acquired during a marriage, it's community. So people all the time will buy properties and will put a mortgage in just one person's name, but technically in Texas and in the community property states, those belong equally to both spouses.
Right. And like in theory, it would seem like it would make things easier. So you each come in with something that's off the table, and everything that you create in the middle is both of yours. But like, what if you have like a rogue person? Like, what if I'm just like, I'm going to go and I'm going to, swipe my card at Neiman Marcus and I'm going to go buy electronics and I'm going to do all these things. And I work up like $50,000 of debt. Like, are you going to have to pay for half of that?
So that's when, if they go down the litigation road, or if they go, and I guess also in the mediation process could be the same, they can request what's called a marital estate reimbursement claim, which is also synonymous with a waste claim. So if it's believed that one spouse has wastefully spended marital funds, they could say, that's not fair to me that you spent $50,000 of our money together. Will you please consider that to be a debt from you back to the marital estate? And which then in effect means that I get $50,000 more of marital assets in the split than you do. make up for that. So in a negotiation situation, that's really up to both spouses to agree. Well, I didn't waste money on Nordstrom. I was just buying things for the kids that they needed for school. Those were like uniforms and things that they had to have. Mm-hmm. Right. So there are usually going to be arguments coming from the other direction to whittle that number down or to make it go away entirely. But if they can come to an agreement about the amount, then that is the way that they can approach it. And if they went to court, they would need a forensic accountant like me to step up and say, I found all of these transactions in their community accounts. It is community funds that were used, and it does appear to be potentially wasteful spending if the legal experts decide that those are outside the bounds of reasonability for this particular couple. Mm-hmm. If they went shopping at Nordstrom every month for their entire marriage and they just kept doing the same thing they were doing all along, then a judge might say, that's just your normal spending habit. So why would you ask for money back now?
Yeah. And part of it is like, I think that a lot of people that get divorced or in relationships, like literally money blind, like, and that's normal. Like, I'm not, like I'm being silly about it, but like a lot of marriages, there's one person that's operating the finance and one person that's just oblivious or purposefully, being left out. But a lot of times it's just willful ignorance that you're like, well, things got paid for, they handled the finances. I did these other things. But the reality is a lot of people just, they'll have separate credit cards, or they run things on the credit cards and then pay them off once a month. But nobody's actually looking at the expenses. Mm-hmm. And then you go and get divorced. And it's like everybody wants to hyper look at the expenses and be like, wait a second, when in reality, if you guys are having issues right now, most divorces result from like, I would say at this point, mental health issues or money. And so in those cases, if money is the issue, like some of the things that we've been telling people is like, start having that conversation. Like, what do we have? What do we owe? Like, where's our mortgage at? Where's our car loan at? And if you start getting pushback from those conversations or those questions of like, why do you need to know that? Why are you asking those questions?
Radar goes up then. Yeah.
That's the red flags. Mm-hmm. And so, in that capacity, it is about starting to like, because here's the thing, here's an interesting concept. I think women get divorced mentally years before they pull the trigger to actually get through the divorce. So by the time your spouse,
some men do too, when they're the ones who pull the trigger. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. Generally,
men are planning for it financially, right? They might be planning it for it financially because they already like divorced you as well in their heads. But for women, it's more an emotional kind of situation. And so you have people, like, so how do you plan for some of it? You start asking questions. You start, like I tell people to even do it under like an estate planning concept. Like if you two have children and you don't know where anything is, even if that person is hyper controlling in the marriage or finances, you're going to be in a world of hurt if you don't know what happens if that person doesn't come home tonight, right?
My favorite thing to tell people is, not really my favorite, but I love saying your marriage is going to end in death or divorce one way or another, unless you're lucky enough to sink together on the Titanic. And in either scenario, you need to know where your shit is and what you've got. So it's a little bit of a tough love statement and kind of morbid to think about, but it's accurate. You need to know, you need to understand.
But the conversation, like everybody thinks that these conversations are going to be so hard with their spouse. And I will tell you that these conversations, if you want to have them in court, you're going to be paying like $1,000 to $2,000 an hour for you guys to have these difficult conversations in court. And quite frankly, nobody really cares about your emotions at that standpoint.
Right.
You
They
know,
don't
so
usually even care about your affair if you had one, yeah.
like if somebody's going to freak out about you asking these questions, they're going to freak out. Do you want to pay $2,000 an hour to have an audience? Or do you want to start to try to have those conversations like in the context of, and if you're concerned about stuff, you can start looking around at the mail. Like mail is going to come for statements of different accounts. Like what are some of the documents that you even like get people started on whenever you're doing like the budgeting and kind of like just starting to get a handle on it? Like what are some of the things they need to start collecting if they see them around, kind of thing?
A credit report.
Oh, that's a good one.
That usually is a pretty good indicator of debts.
But you can run your own credit report. Like that should be your first step. You have control over that.
I mean, yeah, there's apps for that are free too. Credit Karma is great. It really can give you a lot of helpful information for free and instantly.
And if you have a credit card, a lot of times a credit card will allow you to get like a free credit report.
Yep.
You have to go into your back end of your online credit card, but that should be a first step, because if you did have a spouse that put your name on certain things that you were not aware of, it's going to show up on that credit report. Like even probably stuff that you're like, oh, I thought that was closed. That might even show up, but you might want to clean that up at that time anyway.
Yep.
Okay, credit report is a great idea starting. What else should they kind of get together?
I really like it when they have like credit card statements too for several months to look at historical costs, and also to find some of those hidden things that are hitting their accounts every month that maybe they're not using anymore too.
Well,
so clean it up.
If you're looking at the bank statement, so like if you have a joint account, you're going to see a payment of, let's say $1,000 to Citibank or credit card ABC, right? So you really don't know what that's
for.
Yeah. So you got to go.
Credit card statements are helpful because that's also usually where most people are spending their everyday expenses too, to try to get points or cash back or whatever. You'll see debit cards too, but mostly I see people spending their money on credit cards, other than the auto drafts that come out of their account regularly for things like utilities and mortgage payments. Everything else that's not like that, and even some of those things are hitting the credit card statement. So that's really where I send people first, is like, let's look at that historically, and if we can figure out what's yours versus what's your spouse's, then that's great. If we can't, then we'll kind of look at it and think, okay, how would you be living differently if you had the 100% financial responsibility or choice in your situation? So that's how we start building a budget, is really like, what do you want your life to look like, and how do we financially fund that? The historical data is very helpful for a starting point. I don't always request that though. If people are like, I didn't have any control over the money, I don't have any idea of what we were spending, and really I didn't spend much anyway, so let's start from a clean slate. So then I'll say, all right, well, let's start looking at, what is the average cost of living in the area that you are? What is the what are the rent prices in your area for the types of homes that would be the right size for you, and what can you get mortgage wise too? How can you, how much do you need income wise to qualify for? Because I always encourage people not to rent for too long, because that is real estate is just one of those assets that is a no-brainer if you can figure out how to make it work, because rent is just money down the drain for long periods of time that could be turned into equity very easily. So if that's an option for people, that's always the first thing that I'm trying to help people figure out, is how can they qualify? So,
well, in some states you actually have to, because we were watching something, one of our friends' podcasts, and they were talking about Florida. And in Florida, you have to have like certain statements that you're submitting to the court. Like other states may not have any actual requirements to put those documents into the system whenever you're filing for divorce.
Are you talking about if they're pro se or just period if they file for divorce? Okay.
Period. Yeah. I was a little surprised, like 12 months of bank statements and like multiple, and it wasn't just a requirement to develop, to analyze these. It was a requirement of the court to say like what your spending was or what your, because a lot of states are going to try to move towards AI of, doing divorce. Like there's going to be advancements in the future that they probably think they could run a tax return through some system and figure out an analysis. But I was surprised that the state required some statements. But that is, part of this is what do you need to do to come to an agreement with your spouse? And it may not be that complicated. Like if you can easily split the cars or you're renting and you can both move out and you got some other stuff, like that's not that difficult. It's when you get into understanding, like you talked about community property state. I'm in a state where you pretty much got to prove everything, and even if you came in with something, you might not be able to protect it. So
Yep.
It might be too late at the time that you get divorced that it's already done. And all the things that you do to hide it is going to look bad on you in court. Like if you're a business owner and you're like, oh shit, I don't want them to find out about this, and you're hiding stuff, like the odds are it's going to get found out in court. And I don't think people understand that when we see financial statements or numbers, we see patterns. And when those patterns break, we show the court that there's a break in the pattern. And those breaks in the pattern are going to show that your story doesn't quite line up to what the actual, what the bank statement says. Like you say, oh, I never go to Chick-fil-A. And it looks like you go to Chick-fil-A twice a week, pretty regular, Wednesday, Friday at 5:05. Like your patterns are going to be basically a trail of what you've done historically. So if you think you're going to start to do something different, it's almost like we're going to now very much see the pattern. And that's why we encourage people to not try to hide the ball, to try to have conversations and say, like, let's be reasonable. Let's talk about that, because your most reasonable conversation is going to be better than any conversation you have in court.
And much less expensive.
Much less expensive.
And much less time consuming.
Like 1 hour with people in the divorce world is like $300, $400, $500. If you're on the coast, like some of the people's just automatic rates are $900 an hour. Like just, and they're like, oh, I'll discount it but like on East Coast and West Coast for an expert or a lawyer, you could pay anywhere from $200-$300 to $900. And you have to try to figure out, like, okay, what are you fighting about? Are you fighting about kids and money? Are these people going to help you deal with the kids and money kind of situation? So, but I don't know. What other suggestions do you have for people to start to get their money in order, at least?
To prepare for negotiations or to prepare for?
Just even prepare for, because some people be like, I don't know where my utilities are. Like I encourage people to maybe have your spouse like you need to get logins for these accounts as well. Like you need to have your name put on. If you're not on the utility, they might not answer any questions. So you actually might have to have your spouse add you or give you an online and not their online login. Because if they change their online login and they don't, because that's what they would do, and then I didn't tell you the password. Oh, you can't get into the account. I'm sorry. Like those are some of the tricks that we will kind of see in the situation.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's hard to anticipate that when you're not planning for divorce, because in the normal estate planning world, it's very normal to suggest to people that they put together a spreadsheet that lists out all of the financial institutions of all of their accounts, all the types of accounts they have, account numbers, and username and passwords for all of them, because most of those institutions don't allow more than one person to access them, more than one account for the same account number. So it's hard to be able to get access to those if one of the spouses just decides to change the password. So that's unfortunate. But when the accounts are in both names, you can always call the institution and get information if you're one of the names on the account. It's when you're not that things get more challenging. So
yeah,
try to make sure that your name is actually included on the account for all the accounts that you have, and then get access to all of them online with the one spreadsheet. Just put it all in one place and password protect the spreadsheet, for God's sakes. My fraud examiner license always reminds me, I see the CFE on the screen, even it reminds me to tell people, don't let yourself get screwed by having your identity hacked, especially to that magnitude when you've got everything in one place.
Right.
Protect it, and put the password somewhere else. Like, don't put it on a sticky note on your screen. I have seen people do that. Actually, people have done that for me intentionally. They put things on my desk with a thumb drive and then a little sticky note on it that has the username and password. I'm like, oh, that's brilliant. That's really helpful. I mean,
well, and I think we've been going for about an hour. So
yeah, we have.
That we have showed quite a bit. But in general, some of the things that we're doing that you can find us is that, we have divorce training, and we have a lot of information that's coming out. You have some training regarding how to budget and post-divorce budgeting, which I think is really also very helpful in this space. But, if you check out valuationmediation.com, and in future lives, we're going to try to kind of answer questions, but really just talking about what people might experience in the court system, financial issues. So Amy and I will be back talking about some of those things, and hopefully have a different way of broadcasting. But for now, I think that this was very helpful, Amy. I appreciate it. If you have anything else to offer, please do.
Absolutely. Maybe next time we can talk about how people can keep the cost and time commitment and headache in the divorce process as low as possible.
Yeah, there's definitely ways to be efficient, but I think that means that you have to do some of the work, right? You got to be an active participant in advocating for yourself and being your biggest cheerleader, and people like us can help you navigate that. So hopefully we'll be doing that. And then if there's any comments, then we'll probably address them in some version of a video in the future. So I appreciate it, Amy. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been fun. Happy Thanksgiving.
Yes.